everybody. Thank you yet again for logging on. It's great to see people who have been attending meetings with us for the past few weeks and 2 months. And for those of you who this is your first time, welcome. Really happy to have you on with us. We've been going over a lot of really interesting topics, and today's topic is definitely continuing on with that pattern. I'm pretty excited to listen to Mr. David's presentation. And of course, we're gonna make sure everyone's on mute throughout this presentation. And again, thank you for attending. And Tom, you can go ahead and give David his introduction.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, today we've got a very, I think, an exciting speaker. I was blessed to have him in class, our Master Gardener class last year, and it was interesting. I knew right away he had some background in biology because he was always correcting me in a great way about some of the things. And I was totally amazed at some of the biology that I probably missed through my education. Even though we're very close in age, David is a wealth of knowledge. He was born in Chicago. Actually, he and his wife met when he was stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, in the military. He got his bachelor's at Indiana University, and he got his master's down in Louisiana at Monroe College, and he got his PhD at St. Louis University. And he studies, he's had several jobs, starting in Chicago at a women's college. He was at Lamar in Beaumont, Texas. And then he spent 20 years at Valdosta State University down in Georgia. And his main topics were fish, reptiles, and he's just a world of knowledge about all that stuff. So I asked him if he would talk on some topic. We put that out, and lo and behold, he chose to talk about agriculture and hunter-gatherer. And I thought that was such a fascinating topic. I looked at his PowerPoint, and I think we'll be amazed at some of the things that go on. So David, I'm happy to introduce you and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I actually have taught a course at Valdosta State University called Human Biology and Ecological and Evolutionary Perspective. And this is one of the presentations I would give to the class. I've modified it somewhat, but it was a course for non-biology majors who had to have a science course. So what I'm going to do is talk about, primarily focus on agriculture today, but also talk a little bit about animal science, because agriculture has significantly influenced animal science, like the raising of cattle and hogs and things like that. And I'll also be talking about hunter-gatherers, because early peoples living on all over different parts of the world before agriculture began to develop, one of the things they were doing is hunting animals, and at the same time also out and collecting potential food sources, such as potatoes, different kinds of grains and things like this. So they did not have a highly organized agricultural system then, but they began to develop it. And if you look at this PowerPoint presentation, one of the things you'll see is a plant called teosinte and another one called corn. Okay, and we all know what corn is because we make popcorn, we buy corn and eat it for dinner and things like this. And what is interesting is about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, the Aztecs down in Central America and southern Mexico took the teosinte plant and started cultivating it because they could eat the seeds. And then they started finding variations in their cultivars, and they ended up developing corn. So the Europeans, when they moved into North America and Central and South America, discovered that the Indians in this area had corn. And it was interesting because the Aztecs and other groups of Indians in Central America, when they developed the corn, they started moving that corn out, so that when the early Europeans came in and they moved into the area of Southern Illinois and Missouri and places like that, that corn plants that the Aztecs had developed had by this time been moved all the way up into the Great Plains and places like that. So it's kind of fascinating how even the American Indians were engaged in agriculture as much as 10,000 years ago. Okay, so let's talk about some of the benefits and the negatives of agriculture. Some of the benefits is that it produces a lot more food crops for us. So we have a lot more food production. And just think about all the different types of crops we have and how we farm and grow them all over different parts of the world. Also, a lot of these crops, such as corn and stuff, even 5,000–6,000 years ago, when you would grow it, you could then store it and dry it so that you could then have that food available through the winter. These same crops, such as, say, feed corn, can then be used as food sources for animals such as cattle, horses, hogs, and a variety of other animals, chickens, things like that. The other thing it does is it lets us engage in labor other than in farming. In other words, a few people might grow the crops and then transfer or sell those crops to other people, and they in turn can engage in labor processes that allow us to engage in a more complex social system and society in general. The other thing that's interesting is because we were able to grow these crops, and we also engaged in what is called animal husbandry, where we started taking wild horses and converting them into domestic horses, and the same thing for cats and dogs. And I have listed down there your favorite snake. I've always been a snake lover. But there's also some negatives associated with heavy crop production. For instance, research work going back 6, 8, 10,000 years ago shows that sexual inequality developed, and at least that's what they estimated. And what they mean by that is men started to become more and more dominant as they produced these crops, and they suppressed women into a more lower level of social position and things like this. It also resulted that some groups of people were not producing crops. So what happened is social inequality began to develop between different groups of people in different parts of the world. And I'm not just talking about North America, I'm talking about the whole world here. Diseases also began to become more prominent because of the changes in our food processing. And I'll be talking about that. Despotism, or the domination of certain world leaders became more prominent because they had access to those crops, and they could then start to develop military groups that would work under them, and they could then start to dominate and control other groups. And by this time, when despotism came along, world populations were also getting a lot larger. Genocide, or the going to war and engaging in processes that resulted in the death of other people, became more prominent as crops became more and more abundant. It's also led us to very different complexities in our human populations, and we've been able to develop highways, extensive farmlands, extensive cities. Just think how big Chattanooga is, how big Chicago was, where I was born. We've altered rivers and put dams up and things like this. And the world population is heading towards overpopulation. For instance, when I was born in 1946, the world population was about 1.7 billion, and now it's over 7 billion. So how long can we keep going before we reach a point when the world population starts to become too great? Agriculture and animal husbandry, they're interlinked strongly. And we have very abundant crops and diverse food supplies around the world. And this is especially true for what we would call first world countries, such as the European countries, certain Asian countries, certain parts of Africa, and of course, North and South American countries. But we also have third world countries that lack resources. They are not developing in the same way we are. It's also permitted the development of very complex societies. We can interact more because We don't have to, everybody doesn't have to spend their time engaged in agriculture or hunting so that they can get a decent food supply. They can go into the grocery store and buy it. It's also permitted the development of more complex tools. So think about the early tools that were made, arrowheads, scraping devices and things like that by the early people 10, 12, 13,000, 30,000, even 100,000 years ago. And now we have complex tools such as the internet, space, ships, cars, trucks, all kinds of stuff that's out in my garage. And this has permitted the development of complex domiciles or living places. So early peoples lived in caves and rock ledges. As they developed a food supply that was better, they had more time to develop building tents and simple lodges and things like this. And now we have homes that are relatively complex and made out of wood and brick. We have skyscrapers, apartment complexes, malls, manufacturing centers, motels, and everything else, so that when we travel, we have places we can stay. And also our life history patterns have changed substantially. And what I mean by life history is everything that happens from the time you are born until the time you pass away, and all the different biological events that occur over that time period. And a good example of that is my wife and I have had 2 children. Okay, so that's part of our life history pattern, is us having children. And now we've got 3 grandchildren, or will have 3 grandchildren soon. And we are also living longer lives. So our life history pattern has changed from early peoples who were dying by their late 30s and early 40s at the latest. And now look at the number of us who live to be well into our 70s, 80s, 90s, the number of people who are living to be 100 years old now. So our life history patterns are changing because, again, of agriculture and its influence on animal husbandry. Early hunters and gatherers, a brief history. Hunters and gatherers, they were essentially scavengers. And what they did is they had developed early tools such as spears and bows and arrows and stuff, and they could go out and hunt. As they proceeded to do this more and more, it let them also start to develop slightly larger complex groups of individuals, such as, well, if you think about the Native Americans and the size of different tribal groups just in and around Northwest Georgia, Tennessee, and the Chattanooga area. Some really complex societies developed, such as the Cherokee. And there has been kind of an interesting process. Archaeological research work has suggested that as the societies became more complex, women were more and more forced into the gathering, in other words, going out into the woodlands and finding food crops such as pecans, acorns, and things like this. And the men were the hunters. But it's interesting, I just read a paper this past week, a new research paper that came out that shows that different tribes, the women were doing as much hunting as the men were, and they've just discovered and worked all that out. So there was less discrimination between men and women in the societal structure than they originally thought there had been. Again, an agricultural society, fewer people produce more than sufficient food supply for much of the world. This has then permitted the expansion of other things such as more complex societies, advanced educational systems, and think about how we now have grade school, middle school, high school, and that goes and extends. Some of us go on and go to college, and some of us go on and get a master's degree and then a PhD. And these different levels of education are important because it lets us continue to develop and work through the complex societies that we need. We also have more advanced tool development. When I was stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, one of the things I really loved was going to the Glover farm, because they'd let me come in and hunt arrowheads there. And I found it fascinating how the Indians were making all these arrowheads and stuff that I found. But now look at, if we go out and go hunting, we use rifles and things like that. Also, we have, think of our healthcare system and the advances that have taken place in that, so that people who were dying from cancer and heart disease in their 40s and 50s back in the early 1900s, we now can engage in all kinds of medical processes to extend these lives much, much longer. And the healthcare system has become quite incredible, especially in the pharmaceutical area. All this development has occurred because of the development of agriculture. Agriculture and animal husbandry has also influenced us in a lot of other ways. For instance, they estimate agriculture and animal husbandry started to develop about at least 10,000 years ago. And now they're finding more recent research work is pushing that back, so that in some areas of the world, agriculture and animal husbandry are going back 13, 14, 15,000 years. We're still doing all that type of research work and on agricultural systems and to make and improve them even more. For instance, early corn, which was developed from the plant called teosinte, now we have corn plants which allow and produce much larger heads of corn and more pieces of corn on each plant. So we get more results from that. Also, animal science has taken off and gone to a very high level. And what I'm going to do is talk about a brief review of agriculture and the culture of animals for food, labor, and pets in some of these next slides. Okay, if you're looking at this map, this is kind of interesting because they estimate that since agriculture started about 11,500 years ago, that is about the same time the glaciers in North America and Northern Asia and Europe were beginning to melt and recede. And since agriculture was developing before the glaciers completely receded, what this map shows you is all the different areas where major agricultural events were taking place. So you can see agriculture was not occurring in northern parts of North America because we had the glaciers extending all the way down past the Great Lakes. The same thing was occurring over in Europe and Asia. The glaciers were so far south that you couldn't grow crops there. So this map shows the different areas of the world, such as the Southeast Asian islands down here, Eastern Asia, India, the Middle East, parts of Africa, Central America and Mexico, and other locations down in South America where early peoples, including the North American and South American Indians, began developing the first crops. So it's quite fascinating to see what they were able to do. At the same time, they started developing more complex tools. For an example, when I was doing a lot of arrowhead hunting on a local farm outside of Clarksville, Tennessee, I found what is called an auger or a pestle. And that's a rock. And an auger and a pestle are two rocks which the Indians modified the shape and structure of those rocks so they could use them to grind corn. And at the same time they were developing that, similar tools were being developed over in parts of Asia and Africa. But one of the key things is that this required group efforts to produce these large numbers of crops. So human society started to grow and develop larger and larger communities. And this was happening multiple times in multiple different parts of the world. It wasn't like one part of the world started this and then it spread from there. Agricultural origins, that depends on where the different crops are from. For instance, teosinte was found in Central America and Southern Mexico. And so the Aztecs and other Indian groups in that area were able to develop that into corn that we have today. And now, of course, we've spread corn all over the world. As I've already mentioned, climate was a critical factor, but other things like sweet potatoes and just the general potatoes that we eat, different types of crops such as oats and wheat and barley and things were growing in different parts of the world. And people started learning how to develop these into sustainable crops. One of the interesting things that I think needs to be asked is when did early man start to know and understand the importance of soil? For instance, certain soil types are not suitable for agriculture or the development or growing of certain types of crops. Early man had to also know and understand which soils were best for growing crops. The end results, for instance, the Great Plains are ideal for growing wheat and barley, but they're not quite as good for growing corn. But as you move into what is now Illinois and Indiana, those areas had soil types which were much better for growing corn, and corn became a big staple crop with the American Indians in that part of the North America, because the soil was better there. Now, here's something interesting, and then this is one of the things I've always enjoyed as a biologist. I'm talking about humans and the agriculture we engaged in. We're not the only agriculturalists in the world. There's something called a leafcutter ant, and leafcutter ants go out and they build sizable mounds of soil, and they have a very large complex of individuals, of ants living in that mound of soil. And one of the things they do is they go out and they snip off or cut off bits of leaves, and they take those leaves down into their insect mound or their ant mound. Certain ants are what we call the leaf cutters, and they are the ones who cut the leaves up. Other ants in the same community or same colony are collectors, and they carry the leaves back to the ant mound. And then some of the ants down in the mound modify the structure of the leaves that they've been cut up, and they set these leaves up next to other leaves which are already becoming covered with the fungus. And it's the fungus that the ants prefer to eat. It provides them with a primary food source. So if you think about it, here we have small ants, what do we call leaf cutters now, and they're living in agricultural society as an insect. It's quite fascinating. And the queens benefit from this, because when new queen ants are born and they mature and they migrate out of the community, they pick up and take the fungus with them as they start their own new community, maybe 100 yards away from the original community, so that the queens benefit from the agricultural processes that were taking place in the ant nest that they came out of. And then if you turn around and think about it, we as humans, we have our own counterparts in the development of different crops. For instance, humans have taken corn, wheat, rye, rice, bananas, berries, carrots, lettuce, and a lot of other different types of crops. And they were simple, basic plants, and we've engaged in considerable development of these and modified the genetic structure of these plants so that they produce more corn, more wheat, more rye, bananas, and all these other things that we like to buy at the grocery store and eat. So early humans engaged, while they did not know and understand the genetics or the DNA involved in it, they understood that certain plants would produce more crops or more food source than another plant, say. So when they were working on teosinte, they realized that some teosinte plants produced more seeds than others. So they used those teosinte plants to produce new plants. And the end result is they started to modify the genetic structure of the teosinte plant. And now we have these complex, large corn plants that we have today. And this also then, of course, affected animal husbandry quite a bit. And even insects and other animals have engaged in animal husbandry. For instance, certain ants bring aphids, or what are called milk aphids, down into their ant mound, and they maintain them down there because they produce a fluid which is beneficial, and it's called honeydew. And it's beneficial for the ants to suck up that honeydew that comes off of the aphids and consume it, and it helps them produce a more diverse diet. And ants also engage in maintaining what are called mealybugs and different types of scale insects. They also work and maintain and raise caterpillars because of the benefits they get from the caterpillars, tree hoppers, and also what are called spittlebugs. So all these different insects, the ants actually control and develop just as if they were engaged in animal husbandry, just like we do. Human counterpart to that is the breeding of cattle, horses, hogs, chickens, and a variety of other things. My dad's side of the family actually came off of farms, a sizable farm in Effingham, Illinois, and I used to go over to my aunt and uncle's farm, and I found it quite fascinating when I was a little kid, seeing their cattle and all the feed corn they raised and the hogs they had and the chickens and everything else. But the best part of the whole farm, in fact, was the fact that they had a really good catfish pond to go fishing in. We are not the only organisms that engage in agriculture and animal husbandry. There are other animals that are doing the same thing. One of the key things is that as we have raised cattle and horses and hogs up into usable organisms for animal husbandry, we've at the same time bred these animals so that they are not as capable of caring for themselves. So we have to end up going and taking care of them that way. Agriculture and animal husbandry, just some examples. Example of the different crops development in the Near East. Agriculture began to take off, and so did animal husbandry about 8,000 years ago. In Greece, about 6,000 years ago. Great Britain, only 3,500 years ago. And the same thing for Scandinavia. And one of the influencing factors as you look at Scandinavia, Great Britain, and Greece is the fact that the glaciers were retreating. So people were expanding their locations and bringing agriculture and animal husbandry to new areas. So an interesting question you can ask, then, are we better off than the hunter-gatherers of the past and the present because of what we have? Well, it depends in part on how you look at it and how you feel about this, but we have more advanced societies, so I'd say yes, because these societies have in turn allowed us to develop complex medical systems which are allowing us to live longer. We also have a more diverse food supply because we now can transfer those food sources all over the world. But at the same time, if you look at certain problems since the Industrial Revolution, you can say we've also had things that have worked to the negative, and I'll be talking about those. Many people have suffered over the past 10,000 years because agriculture and animal husbandry haven't always gone the right direction. And it's only in the last 150 years or so that we've really been able to diversify these systems so they work better for us. Some more facts on hunter and gatherers. One group of interesting individuals is the Kalahari bushmen down in Africa, and they're still hunting and gathering. And part of the reason they do that is because of the climate. It's so dry there, they can't grow crops that efficiently. But there are still plants out there that are growing in the wild that they can harvest, and they can also hunt. Studies on the Kalahari bushmen have demonstrated that they actually have more leisure time. They have more time to sleep. They don't work any harder than people who live in agricultural type systems. And their food sources are very rich in proteins and are better balanced some ways because of the wild plants they eat and the wild animals that they hunt. Agricultural and animal husbandry has also allowed us the development of what we might define as the modern businessman. One of the key things when you're comparing the lifestyle of the modern businessmen to people like the Kalahari bushmen, the modern businessman has less free time. He has to work more, get into work in the morning. I know as a biologist, I frequently found myself going in teaching classes and then coming home and working on notes and things even in the evening. The other thing is that modern society, especially starting back in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around 1850, started to develop poorer diets, because one of the things that people were doing is they were growing specific crops in very high quantities and then primarily just eating that crop. the end result is, and they didn't understand this at the time, is that they didn't have as diverse a diet, and the less diverse diet resulted in health problems. And now, you know, we have a lot of different things like the DASH diet and things like this that are being promoted, so we eat and consume a more diverse food supply. And with our transportation systems, we can move those food supplies all around and successfully increase the diversity of our diets. Some additional hunter-gatherer facts. Health, as agricultural took off, people began to suffer more. We suffer less disease now, but back in 1840s, the Irish were primarily producing potatoes and eating primarily potatoes, especially in the winter. And the end result was that they did not have a good diet, and they ended up producing what is called the Irish potato crop famine. And a lot of Irishmen at that time were becoming quite ill. The Russians did the same thing back in the 1950s and 60s, where they primarily focused on growing large quantities of wheat, and in the certain times of the year, eating primarily wheat and not other diverse food supplies. The same thing happened in Nigeria, Africa, and as recently as 2005 and 2006, and Shala, Africa, the Shala food crisis also occurred in Africa in 2010. And these African famines were primarily due to the fact that they were growing specific crops, and they also started to experience droughts at that time. So the food supply became much more limited, and only crops that could tolerate lack of sufficient water were the ones that were growing. Paleopathology looks for signs of disease in ancient peoples. And one of the ways they do this is they look at bones, teeth, and other body structures that are preserved. It's also kind of interesting because people who have lived in caves and certain areas like that, when they've defecated in the caves or produced feces, that feces becomes mummified in the cave because of the environment of the cave drying it out. So the paleopathologists have been able to go back and collect this feces and actually identify the existence of certain types of bacterial and viral diseases in that fecal material. That has allowed them to turn around and also look at life history patterns, or what is LHAP that I've got written there, and see how these people survived and how well they did. Monocropping by the Greeks, we can look at that and get an idea. When the Greeks were monocropping, or just growing one or two, maybe three crops at the most, and eating primarily just those crops, one of the primary things that you see that before monocropping developed, Greek men had an average height of about 5 feet 10 inches. And when they started monocropping back in the early 1900s, the average man was only growing to 3 feet or 5 feet 3 inches because he wasn't getting a sufficient diet. And the same thing happened to women. Prior to monocropping, they reached 5 feet 6 inches. And after that, they dropped down to only 5 feet 1 inch. Prior to monocropping, most Greeks only had maybe one cavity in all the teeth in their mouth, and the average number of cavities jumped to 7 during monocropping. Tooth loss was maybe 1, whereas during monocropping, a lot of Greeks lost much more. Same thing, the enamel in their teeth became much poorer. And 2 diseases, yaws, which affects the skin, the bones, and the joints of the body, and syphilis became much more common during monocropping. And so did such things as osteoarthritis. The Americans and the American Indians, and when they started developing corn and it became a primary product for them, their health also continued to decrease. Key points is monocropping corn and eating only corn in the winter months, that led to a neurological dysfunction. And you may have heard about what is called the shaman, or what is called the witch doctor. And research work has shown that the shaman or the witch doctor developed this unusual behavior because they were so psychologically impaired from eating a very non-diverse diet. One of the things that these diets, monocropping, did, though, is it let the development of what are called the mound builders. The Indians started building these complex mounds and making it part of their societal structure. And so there's the Cahokia mounds in Collinsville, Illinois. Mound building cultures also were found during what is called the Archaic and Woodland period. There's what is called the Coles Creek culture, the Mississippian culture, and the Fort Ancient and the Plaquemine cultures, and they were all mound builders. In Georgia, if you're going down Highway 75 and you're near Etowah or Kalahari near Blakely, Georgia, there are mounds down there. And if you're here in Tennessee, there's a place called Pinson Mounds in eastern Tennessee. And again, these were developed by the mound builders or the early Indians. And they were able to build these mounds, they estimate, because part of the society was producing corn and other crops, but mostly corn. That left the rest of the society the time to build these mounds, which they used for religious rituals and things like that. So what explains the difference between hunters and gatherers and the farmers? One is monocropping, the other is population growth and the occurrence of diseases. Also greater class differences, possible sexual differences between men and women, although they're beginning to find that wasn't as extreme as they originally thought. Monocropping actually also allowed the development of more children, because food supply that women who were staying in place at the domiciles and stuff could eat and then care for her children and things like that. And that's it, folks.
That's great, David.
We don't need to go back to hunting and gathering, but we need to use our science and make sure that we have a good diverse food supply and that we use it accordingly. And also take care of other parts of the world, like third world countries that haven't achieved the food supplies and stuff that we have now. We can step in and help them.
I was gonna ask you a question. How much of the advancement was accidental versus intentional? So, I mean, I know that when crops began to change things, I know they made some accidents here and there, and they would see that would work or make something grow better, and they would implement that. Do you know?
I'm not sure the best way to describe that, but what I find interesting is how what we used to think of as primitive cultures really were not nearly as primitive as we thought. And granted, since the Industrial Revolution began shortly before around 1850 or so, and we've really taken off because our populations are getting bigger. We're developing more useful systems such as computer systems and things like this. We can really move forward very rapidly. But other societies were still moving forward much better than I thought. One of the things I find quite fascinating is what you would call cave art. It's not related to agriculture, but the hunter and gatherers were engaging in a lot of cave art, and I love to see that kind of stuff, that societies 10,000, 12,000 years ago were producing artwork inside of caves and on ledges and rock systems and things like that. But and it also, I think, tends to parallel what they were achieving in the development of new crops and the animal science, where they were breeding animals into a more useful group. Like how many people have dogs? Raise your paw. But early research work indicates that dogs were first bred from wolves over in China. They now have discovered multiple sites where dogs were being bred from wolves throughout Africa, Northern Africa primarily, Spain, and other parts of the world. So a lot of different societies were doing a lot of different things. And I think an important question we have trouble answering is how much communication was taking place between different parts of the world and allowing different areas to develop different crops and different animals for animal husbandry and things like that.
People who lived in areas near the coast, like in Savannah there, and Florida, there were lots of Indians, and I'm sure their diet had a lot of seafood. But did they grow many crops, and how did their health compare to people who were living like in Tennessee, getting a different type of meat source, protein source?
I'll be quite honest, I don't really know that much about that type of system. I know well, one of the things, like I mentioned it already, the American Indians had their witch doctors and stuff. It would be interesting to know what other less well-developed societies that were starting to monocrop and things like that, how much that was affecting them. I mean, I talked about the Greeks. Am I answering your question correctly?
Kind of, yes. I guess you're just saying you haven't done much study with the people who lived in coastal regions and had that type of a diet.
Yeah, and so I have a lot of notes that I didn't put on here, but I actually, when I taught this class, this was only one presentation of about, oh golly, I'll think about a semester and how many different presentations I gave, and on human biology and evolutionary processes. Another thing that's interesting too is we have the Neanderthals, and we have, do you folks know about the Denisovians now? But in northern Asia, what is now Mongolia, there were a group of people that they estimate came out of Africa well over 200,000 years or so ago, maybe even earlier than that. And they formed a group called the Denisovians, and another group of people formed the Neanderthals. And most recently, they have found out that there's genetic differences between the Neanderthals and the Denisovians, but they have found populations of or bones of people who obviously were Neanderthals, Denisovians hybrids. And so these people were interbreeding. So how much were these people moving around different parts of the world and transferring their knowledge to other areas? Just quite fascinating. How many of you know that what the land bridge was, the Bering Straits between Alaska and Mongolia, or northern Asia? And they thought that's where the early American Indians came in. And recent research work now shows that, especially down in South America, the early American Indians in South America are more genetically similar to people coming out of the islands of Southeast Asia. And so now they have concluded that people as much as 30,000 years ago may have been boating across the Pacific into South America and establishing the first Indian communities there. It may be possibly as much as 30,000 years ago, which is quite fascinating.
Dr. Belcher, what do you think triggered the hunter-gatherer communities to make changes? Because some hunter-gatherers continue to hunt and gather, and others moved on a different direction. Because you mentioned 10,000 years ago, when I look at history, we had hunter-gatherers, here in North America, as much as, 3,000 years ago. What triggered some communities to change and others to maintain the same? What triggered the change between hunter-gatherer communities and people who changed, where did the Romans come from? Because they were in large cities and they weren't hunter-gatherers, but we had American Indians who continued to be hunter-gatherers long after the Romans came in from Europe.
Yeah, okay, I see where you're going with that. And that's an interesting point. probably European and Asian societies were developing agriculture and animal husbandry much sooner than a lot of the North American and South American groups. In part, that may have been due to the fact that as people were migrating in the North and South America, they were still expanding and developing and moving about. And as they move about more, they couldn't engage in as much agriculture and animal husbandry. Other factors that might be critical is because they became isolated by moving into North and South America, so they didn't bring that knowledge with them necessarily. But like I say, the Cahokia Indian mounds and demonstrate that up to 10,000 years ago, they were already starting to grow corn there as a monocrop. So it's quite fascinating. And again, I don't know that much about how much communication was taking place in different parts of the world, but I think they're beginning to find it was a lot occurring much more than they originally thought. Now, here's one point that's critical. Think about you're a hunting gathering society and you're converting into an agricultural society. You grow some teosinte and you find certain number of plants produce more seeds, and you think, okay, I can take that plant and start planting it and see if it'll make a lot of plants that produce more seeds. But you have to do that on a year by year by year basis. So it takes a generation or more to take that teosinte and develop it into a simple corn plant. And then you have to go through multiple generations of producing teosinte into a more and more complex corn plant. Part of it is just, how long does it take to develop a simple plant into a complex plant such as wheat or corn or sweet potatoes or barley or something like that. It takes generations, and how many generations does that take? And you can transfer that information along. The other thing too is think about early peoples were only living into their 30s and 40s, only a small percentage was making it into their 50s, so they didn't live as long, so they couldn't transfer of information, couldn't necessarily be as efficient. As these societies were growing larger, they were still hunting. And I think an interesting point is how much did they hunt off the animal life that would have provided them good protein supplies. So they shifted more and more towards agricultural and monocropping because they were hunting off their food supply that way. So that may have been an influencing factor, because an important source of protein for your body is animal tissue. I mean, plants produce it too, but animal tissue also does that. I've often thought that if I hadn't gone into biology per se as a field biologist, that I might have leaned towards archaeology or paleontology or something like that, because I always found that really fascinating and interesting what I learned about through those sciences and things. The other thing that I find fascinating is I did most of my research work on aquatic organisms, and the name Bechler means individual by the stream in German.
Yeah, now my name Stebbins originated from stubble field or stub field, and you can tell where that was, agricultural related, probably cornfield or something way back when. So
well, another interesting thing to think about how agriculture and everything has influencing. Here we are in our Master Gardener Club, and we're at this point in our group, our club or our organization, because of all the events and things that took place over the last 10, 12, 30,000 years, as we developed crops and flowers and plants and herbs and spices and all these other things.
So I really want to thank you for taking the time to put this together. I think you had some of it, but I think you developed quite a bit more. I know you added some nice pictures at my request, and I think that enriched it. And we picked your brain of all the knowledge. So I want to thank you on behalf of our Garden Guests series here, and thank you very much for sharing that with us.
And thank you. I appreciate giving it. I've always enjoyed teaching. So I hope I gave y'all folks a good lecture that gave you some insight into things you might have not seen before.
Thank you very much.
So long, folks. It's been a pleasure.